Thebes, Egypt, year 1230 before Christ. The air above the Nile shimmered with heat as the sun sank behind the pillars of Karnak temple. Inside its deepest chamber, the scent of incense and resin filled the air, while priests moved in silence, their torches flickering against painted gods. At the center lay Neferet, daughter of the high priest of Amun, her body trembling beneath layers of linen. The chants rose louder to drown her muffled breath. Outside, the city still celebrated the festival of the river. Inside, a girl was being mummified before death could claim her naturally. Neferet had been born beneath the shadow of the great columns of Karnak, where her first cry echoed against stone walls older than memory. Her father, Rahotep, was the high priest of Amun, a man whose word could move armies and silence kings. To him, Neferet was not a daughter, but an offering. Her childhood unfolded within the temple's vast courtyards, surrounded by chants, incense, and watchful eyes. She learned to bow before idols before she learned to play, to recite prayers before she learned her own reflection. The women of the temple dressed her in linen robes, brushed her hair with oils, and whispered that she was chosen. She would be a bride of the god, untouched, unbound, eternal. To the priests, her innocence was sacred. To Neferet, it was a chain. Thebes in those years pulsed with wealth and splendor. The streets beyond the temple walls were alive with music, merchants, and children running through the dust. Sometimes, at dusk, Neferet would gaze through the narrow lattice of her chamber, watching them as the sun turned the Nile into molten gold. She envied their laughter, their freedom to touch, to love, to live without fear of offending heaven. Her only companion was the silence of the temple statues and the echo of her own heart. One evening, during the festival of Opet, when the sacred bark of Amun was carried through the city, Neferet glimpsed a face in the crowd, a young scribe named Khemu, his hands ink-stained, his eyes bright with curiosity. He bowed as the procession passed, but his gaze lingered, meeting hers for the briefest instant. It was a look that should have meant nothing, yet to Neferet it shattered the world she had been taught to accept. That night, as the moonlight poured through the columns, she lay awake, hearing his voice, though he had not spoken a word. For the first time, she wondered if the gods she served demanded purity or obedience. The question itself was her first sin. In the months that followed, she sought reasons to leave her chamber to deliver scrolls, to fetch water, to walk the same courtyards where Khemu worked. Their exchanges were few, their words simple, but her heart learned the shape of rebellion. Love was forbidden for a daughter of Amun, yet it bloomed quietly between them, hidden beneath the scent of papyrus and incense. And though neither knew it, the same walls that had sheltered Neferet since birth would one day become her tomb. The days that followed her father's warning felt heavier than stone. The temple walls that once seemed vast and holy now pressed against Neferet like a tomb. Every sound of footstep in the corridor, the rustle of linen made her flinch. The whispers had grown sharper. Servants who once smiled now turned away, muttering prayers under their breath, as if her presence alone could anger the gods. She had not seen Khemu since that night in the courtyard, and she feared that even thinking his name might draw the attention of the priests. The temple air smelled of incense and fear. Her father's eyes, once filled with pride, had turned to suspicion. He spoke to her rarely now, addressing her only in front of witnesses, his words formal, stripped of affection. The man who had raised her to believe she was divine now looked at her as if she were cursed. The silence between them hurt more than any punishment could. One morning, while she prepared the sacred oils for the ritual of dawn, a young servant girl named Iset approached her in secret. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "They are saying you spoke with a man outside the gates." Neferet froze. The words cut through her like a blade. "Who says this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Iset replied softly, "The priests are gathering tonight. They say the god has been offended." Fear spread through Neferet's veins, cold and paralyzing. The priests did not meet to forgive. They met to condemn. She remembered Khemu's voice, calm, kind, full of life, and felt a desperate longing to hear it once more. That night she waited by the lattice of her chamber window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him in the torchlight below, but the courtyard was empty. Only the chants of the priests echoed through the darkness, low and ominous. The following day, Her father summoned her to the inner sanctum. The air was thick with smoke, and a circle of priests stood behind him, their faces painted with solemn purpose. "You have been accused of impurity," Rahotep said, his tone heavy but controlled. "If the gods find you unworthy, they will claim you." His words felt like stone falling into her chest. "Father," she began, but he raised his hand. "Do not speak. Purity is proven through silence." She understood then that he had already made his decision. To question him would be to blaspheme. To resist would be to die as a sinner. She lowered her eyes, her tears falling onto the cold stone floor. As the priests began their prayers, she realized that her fate was no longer her own. The temple that had once protected her now prepared to bury her in its name. That night, the torches outside Neferet's chamber burned until dawn. She lay awake listening to the chants echoing through the corridors, each syllable striking her heart like a hammer. The priests prayed for cleansing, for the removal of sin from the house of Amun, but she knew those prayers were meant for her. The temple had turned against her completely. Servants no longer brought her food. Her chamber door was guarded. The other priestesses avoided her eyes. Only the faint drip of water from the stone ceiling reminded her that time was still moving. She tried to pray as she had been taught, yet the words felt empty. How could the gods she served now thirst for her life? Her only thought was of Khemu. She pictured him in the city, perhaps unaware of what she faced, or perhaps imprisoned like her. The memory of his gentle voice kept her from breaking, though every breath felt like it might be her last. At dusk, the guards came for her. They said nothing as they led her through the torchlit corridors toward the chamber of judgment. The scent of incense and myrrh hung thick in the air. When the doors opened, she saw her father seated upon the dais, surrounded by the priests of Amun, their faces painted with divine authority. Between them stood a stone basin filled with water, the basin of truth. If she was pure, they said, the water would remain calm. If she was guilty, it would ripple under the gaze of the gods. Neferet's knees trembled as she approached. Her father's expression did not change. "You stand accused of breaking your vows," he said quietly. "A daughter of Amun must be untouched by mortal desire. Do you confess?" His voice was neither angry nor kind. It was the tone of a man surrendering to faith over blood. Neferet raised her head. "I have served the gods all my life," she said, her voice barely steady. "If they find fault in me, let them speak." Her words were brave, but fear tightened her chest as she reached for the basin. The water reflected her face, pale, trembling, alive. She held her breath, waiting for the ripples. For a moment, the surface remained still. Then, as if moved by an unseen hand, the water quivered. Gasps filled the hall. A priest stepped forward, declaring, "The gods have spoken. She is unclean." The chamber erupted into prayer. Her father's hands clenched the armrests of his chair. He did not look at her. He only whispered, "May the gods forgive us both." Neferet was dragged away as the chants grew louder, the priests thanking Amun for revealing impurity. She did not resist. Her tears fell silently, absorbed by the dust beneath her feet. In that moment, she understood what the water had truly revealed, not the will of the gods, but the fear of men who worshipped their own power more than any heaven above them. They took her beneath the temple before dawn, down a narrow passageway that reeked of oil and damp stone. The air grew colder with every step, the flicker of torches casting twisted shadows across the carved walls. Neferet's wrists were bound with linen strips, her ankles heavy with bronze cuffs. The priests walked ahead in silence, their heads lowered as if ashamed, yet none dared to defy what had been decreed. When they reached the lowest chamber, the scent of myrrh and resin struck her like a wave. The room was small, lined with jars of sacred oils and baskets of linen, the same materials used for the dead. At its center stood a stone table surrounded by statues of the gods, their painted eyes fixed upon her. It was then that Neferet understood what awaited her. She was not to be purified, she was to be entombed. Her father was already there, standing beside the high priest. His face was unreadable, a mask carved from sorrow and devotion. "The gods demand restoration," the high priest said. "Her flesh must be sealed before sin spreads to the holy ground." Rahotep nodded, though his eyes never met his daughter's. The guards forced Neferet to her knees. She did not cry out. There was no mercy left in this place. The women who once dressed her for ceremonies now approached with trembling hands, dipping cloth into oil and wrapping it around her arms. Each layer tightened her breath. The chant began low, rhythmic, and endless. The priests circled her, speaking words she could no longer hear. Her pulse thundered in her ears as they bound her torso, her legs, her shoulders. The linen clung to her skin, warm and suffocating. She tried to call her father's name, but her voice broke beneath the chanting. He turned away. When the wrappings reached her neck, a tear escaped her eye, rolling into the folds of cloth. A priest brushed it away as if it were an impurity. They spoke of purification, but what she felt was erasure. Her body turned into a relic before her soul had left it. The high priest poured resin over her chest, sealing the fabric into a hardened shell. Her heartbeat slowed beneath it, faint but defiant. As they lowered her onto the cold stone table, Neferet's gaze met the statue of Amun towering above her, its eyes gleaming in the torchlight. She had spent her life serving that image, believing it to be love. Now it watched her die without a sound. The chamber grew still as the final layer covered her face. The linen pressed against her lips, muffling her last breath. The priests placed amulets upon her chest, muttering blessings for an afterlife she had not yet entered. When the door was sealed and the torches snuffed out, only silence remained. And in that silence, the gods heard nothing, only the sound of a girl's heartbeat fading beneath the weight of her own sanctity. The temple above returned to its rhythm as though nothing had happened. Incense burned, offerings were made, hymns filled the air, and the people of Thebes bowed in reverence to the same gods who had demanded Neferet's death. Only the chamber beneath the floor knew the truth. Days passed,